we're going to be talking about the useContext hook, which comes together with the context API. So if you're interested in getting a more in-depth explanation on how the context API works, I have a video on that, so I just linked it in the description of this video. However, I'm going to refresh you or just give you a very simple example on how to implement the useContext hook and in which use cases it would be important. An example that I came up with is this one over here. You see, imagine that you have a project where you have a component, and in this case we created a component called context tutorial, and this component calls two different components inside of it. So there's two different components, one called the login and one called user. And the point of those components are the fact that in the login component you're able to set a username to a user, and in the user component you display that username by showing it like this as an h1. Inside of their components, you see that in the login there's an input, which when you type on it, it sets the username to be whatever you typed on it. And in the user component, basically it just has an h1 which shows the username that has been currently written. And you can see that this works. If I write pageotech, this will work perfectly. And this is one of the most important things when you start getting a little bit more advanced in React, which is how do you actually manage your states? Because the way I presented over here, it works for very simple cases. What I did is I created this state called username in the highest order component, so in the component which calls both the login and the username component, and I passed the set username function to the login component, so that inside of the login component I can change the username, and in the user component I passed as props the username value so that we can display that username value as you can see over here. However, imagine that you have thousands of states. You have not thousands, but you have a lot of states, and you can't just be passing all of them through props because it is not maintainable to have that many props. One way you can do it is by using the context API, which allows you to manage your states very easily. So in order to basically change this logic over here into logic using the context API, the first thing I want to do is I want to remove the props, because with the context API we're not going to need props being passed to each single component, which is one of the benefits of it. I'm going to remove those props, and we're not going to be taking any props. We're actually going to be accessing everything from the context in itself that we're going to create right now. We're going to do everything inside of one file, which is this context tutorial file. However, I do recommend separating your logic and writing some of the context logic in external files. As I mentioned, if you want to check out how to separate and how to organize your project better with context API, just check out my video, which I explain everything. However, over here, we just want to be able to create a context which allows us to have access to all the states that we pass into that context inside of all the components that are rendered inside of this context tutorial component over here. So what we want to do is we want to import from React the create context function like this. And this function over here, it already comes with React, and it allows you to, as the name says, create a context. So over here above our component, I'm going to create a context called I don't know, let me see, app context, and set it equal to create context, and I'm gonna pass no for now, but I'll explain exactly what this means. So how we're going to organize our states, or how you organize your states using context API, is you create this thing called a context, and a context is just almost like a collection of states or a collection of information that you want to access throughout the whole tree of components inside of the component that you are right now. So what I can do is I create this app context, and wherever I want to have access to this states or this information, I just wrap it around with the context. So I'll just come over here and wrap both of this around with this, and I have to say dot provider like this, and then dot provider as well. And inside of this app context dot provider, we will have access to everything, because this is basically what we're saying. as I mentioned, a context is just a collection of states which you can have access to all of those states inside of the components and structures that you put inside of the wrapping provider, as you can see. So what you need to do now is you need to pass a value to this provider, and the value will be all of the states and functions you want to have access inside of it. So in our case, we want to have access to the set username function inside of our login, and we want to have access to our username state in our user component. So we pass both of them over here, and now if I want to have access to both of them, instead of passing them through props, all I have to do is I have to come to one of the components, and then I have to import from React the useContext hook like this, and I have to import the context that I created. In our case, the context that I created is this one over here, the app context. So I do need to have access to it in other files. So what I want to do is I want to export this context so that inside of our user.js, I can just import it from our context tutorial file. We can just import the app context like this. And then inside of this file, inside of this component, we can just say that we want to grab like this values from the useContext hook and access the states inside of the app context that we created over here. And now what we can do is we can just grab whatever states or values we want from this by destructuring like this. So we pass a username and a set username function. So in our user.js, we just want to have access to the username, so we can just grab the username like this. And same thing goes with the login.js. We can come over here, put the same logic, do the same imports, and instead of grabbing the username, we now want to grab the set username, and it should now continue working. If you can see, I refresh my page, I can write, and it will continue working perfectly, and we're not passing props to any of the components. Now, in a very simple and small scale like this example that I just showed, it might seem useless to do something like this, but believe me, when you're working with an application, especially applications where you have something like a user who has a bunch of information about it, so like it has a username, not a password, but a username, a name, an email, a birth date, some kind of information that you want to have access quickly throughout your application, you can just create them and pass them through a context and then have access to those information without having to pass each and every single information through the prop. So that's the basic idea of the useContext hook, and it's a really important one. However, now we're going to be talking about some more advanced hooks which are mostly used to optimize your React application.